Thank you for that. It's a good reminder of how long these systems have been in place and how much they will persist if we don't try to tear them down. So I'm Kahn Gillmor. I'm a technologist at the ACLU. I am a policy-oriented technologist, so I focus on how the infrastructure affects our rights and liberties. Very appropriate with that story there. And I want to talk today a little bit about the cryptographic implications of how digital ID systems work. So I'm interested in this question because there's a big push right now to provide digital ID systems that are like you might hear them called a mobile driver's license. Like, hey, why do we have to carry our driver's license with us? Can't we just put it on our phone? And I want to talk about the cryptographic designs of those systems and what I think the implications are for society. And I want to just go over some of the trade-offs that I see in place. These systems are coming online faster than I would like them to. So I'm going to go a little bit into sort of the architectural design and the terms that we tend to use, and then zoom back out to questions about who the actual adversaries are and what we think these systems are designed to actually do. So the classic digital credential model, we have an issuer, which is like the DMV, who's giving you the driver's license, and there's a holder, who is the person who the ID represents, and at some point there's a verifier, and you might be buying beer, so you might be trying to prove your age to the clerk. You might have a cop come and ask you for your ID, or maybe a website wants to know who you are, right? So these are examples of verifiers. So we have issuer, verifier, holder, and we have the interactions that we have. I'm going to use the term presentation here, where the holder proves something about themselves. Provisioning, where the holder and the issuer get establish that this is like they're going to give you an ID. And then this, we don't really talk about this, but there is actually a communication between the issuer and the verifier, at the very least during setup time. It's sort of a configuration or maintenance thing. How does the verifier know which digital credentials to respect, right? I could set up an issuer. I could run it out of my garage if I had a garage, but I wouldn't expect the police department to accept a credential issued from my garage. So holder, issuer, verifier. So this is how we characterize these models, right? We characterize the models. We say, well, these are the three parties that are involved, and the system is going to work in this particular way. We're going to, figure out how they make the math work so that the system does what we want an ID system to do. And I think Carmela's talk was really a great reframing of like, what are we actually trying to accomplish with these things? Often these systems are just like, well, let's replace the driver's license, and we can just use this wherever a driver's license can be used. But maybe we shouldn't have been using a driver's license in this way the whole time, and therefore just transforming it into a digital thing might not be a good idea. But that's not the way that the work is typically proceeding today. So this is the model. But in fact, there are these other participants that are involved in the model, not just the holder, issuer, verifier. We have a contractor that works for the issuer or the verifier, right? Most DMVs don't have a technical bench deep enough to actually deploy a system that's working as like a certification authority. So they hire somebody to do it. You have the folks who build the device. If you've got a pocket supercomputer, as I expect most of you do, it's made by some company typically. You have somebody who builds the software on the device that handles the digital credential. The verifiers themselves will buy their equipment from somebody. And then you've got network operator. To the extent that any of these things use the network operator might see some traffic. So in fact, we don't have 3 parties involved. We have at least 8, and I'm sure I've missed something. But when we design it cryptographically, we tend to just zoom in and say, okay, 3 parties, how does the system work with those parties? And I just want to remind folks that this is one of the failings of our cryptographic design, where we tend to just throw away all the excess pieces and look at this. So, and again, here's the actions. Those are the arrows that I had in the earlier slide. The provisioning, the holder gets a credential somehow. The presentation, the holder says, hey, here I am. And then some sort of maintenance configuration that happens between the verifier and the issuer. So these are sort of the 3 formal places where the protocol tends to work when we're designing the protocol. So I'm outlining this because I'm trying to put a little bit of tension on the assumptions that we make when we do cryptographic protocol design. Right? Most protocol designs actually won't even talk about this phase. This is a hand-waved phase, and we'll just talk about how does provisioning work, how does the presentation work. So I'm just trying to inject a little bit of dubiousness in how this design process actually happens. And when you design a cryptographic protocol for digital identification, you typically talk about, well, what are the bad outcomes that we're trying to prevent? And so everybody says, well, we want to avoid identity theft. Now, I actually have a real problem. I should have put the word identity theft on the slide. I can't even bring myself to write the term identity theft because the frame of identity theft, I think, is actually a problematic frame. I should have done it on the slides here. So when you hear identity theft, what I hear is someone stole something from me, right? They stole my identity. But that's not actually what happened. They didn't steal my identity. What they did was they impersonated me to some third party, to some verifier. So nothing was stolen from me. In fact, what was stolen was probably stolen from the bank if they took out a loan. They didn't steal it from me. They stole it from the bank by impersonating me, and the bank decided to penalize me by charging me for the fact that they got fooled by the impersonation. So my identity wasn't stolen. The bank's money was stolen. But we frame it as identity theft because the hook goes into the individual and not the institutional frame that's there. So sensitive negative outcomes. Impersonation would be a bad outcome because you can leave people on the hook for whatever the impersonation does. There's another kind of forgery where I want to prove that I'm over 21 because I want to buy alcohol, but I'm not actually over 21. Anybody who's ever actually bought alcohol before they were 21 has done this. But you don't want, when you design the system, you want to avoid the possibility that that's doable in the system. And then there will be some acknowledgement in the system design. We don't want to leak too much sensitive information about the holder. So currently, when I present my driver's license to prove that I'm old enough to go into a bar, which I have not had to do for a while, but the driver's license has a barcode on the back. And some bars, there will be somebody at the door who looks at the license and gives it back to you. And other bars, they'll take it, and these days they will scan the barcode on the back and reveal all of the information that's on the device. You can probably scan it yourself with one of your QR code reading apps, and you'll see everything that they ingest, and we have no idea what happens to that data. Try it when you go into a bar that's doing that. Ask them what happens to the data and watch them stutter, because people have generally not asked that question. But we'd like the system to avoid that. And we'd like also the system to avoid any sort of metadata harvesting. We don't want the system as a whole to produce a record of every time that the ID has been used, or even every time that ID has been provisioned in a way that we don't want. And we also probably don't want the system to allow you to misuse the credentials. So for example, if the credential expires, you shouldn't be able to use it after expiration. Although I will flag that there are some uses that we currently use credentials for where expiration doesn't make much sense, right? Perhaps my driver's license might expire and I should need to be tested again to use it. But I can guarantee you that my age does not expire, even if the credential does. So if I'm using the credential for this purpose, talking about expiration is a little bit goofy. But the folks who design it tend to focus mostly on questions about, can it be misused for forgery? I want to talk a little bit about what that means. So when we design cryptographic systems, we often talk about the adversary and what are the capabilities of the adversary. And when you look at a lot of the mechanisms that we build into these systems and why we build them, it helps to say what adversary is this trying to defend against. And as you can see from the bolded words here, the adversaries that we typically talk about in a digital ID system are an adversarial holder. The system is designed to defend the system from a holder that wants to misuse it. So the individual who's holding the ID is the adversary. That should give you a hint when you look at the protocol design that the system is designed actually to control the user or to limit the user, as opposed to being designed to limit the other parties that are in play here. So we want the provisioning system, for example, to defend the issuer from accidentally giving the credentials to a malicious holder. Are we defending we're defending the issuer from a bad holder. So the holder has to prove something about themselves, in some cases prove something about their device to the issuer to ensure that they can get the credential correctly. So malicious holder, that's the adversary. In a presentation, we don't want a verifier to get tricked by a malicious holder. We're defending the verifier against the holder. Now, if I'm giving my ID to a cop do I want a system that protects the cop, or do I want a system that protects me? I mean, obviously I'm asking this from the frame of not being a cop. But if we ask this as a general situation, where is the power imbalance in that relationship? The systems that are designed are being designed to defend a verifier against a malicious holder. So the holder is the adversary in these systems. And that gives you some intuition about what has been done in this design. Like, what are the assumptions that this design makes? And as I said before, the maintenance and configuration step, the pre-configuration between the issuer and the verifier, is often left entirely out of protocol design documents. They'll mention something like an out-of-band configuration, or the verifiers need to have a list of acceptable issuers or something like that, and we'll just assume that this has been done in some way. Even for the mobile IDs, where you have a cop in the US who's expected to deal with licenses from 50 states, there's a little bit of work that gets done. How do we ensure that every cop knows about the issuers from all 50 states? But there isn't a lot of attention paid in the protocol to what weaknesses there might be in that. For example, imagine a state where the state has decided to criminalize some popular form of medical care. If the police in that state get to learn something about every presentation of an ID, that might be problematic for people, even if their IDs were issued from a different state, depending on how the issuer and verifier communications happen. But that's often not part of the model that we are trying to defend against when we design the system cryptography. So again, parts of common system design, holder device attestation, right? So this says, if I've got my driver's license on my phone and someone is scanning it, can the device prove to the thing that's scanning it that it's running the code that is expected to be run? So that is, can my device prove that it's running code that is not under the control of the device owner itself? You're defending the verifier against a user who might have opened up the hood and tinkered with their car, right? Who might have taken their pocket supercomputer and modified it to do something subtly different. Device attestation says, no, I promise I am running the code that the system is designed to run. And if that's happening, what that means is what you have in your pocket, the supercomputer that you have in your pocket, is running code that is not under your control, because it has to prove that it's running somebody else's code. Once you have code that's not under your control in your pocket, you're in a very different posture with regards to the overall network communication that's happening. Another attribute that people like to have for a system like this, they call device binding. So I could, if I wanted to, sit outside the liquor store with my legitimately granted government ID on a pocket supercomputer, and as a youngster walks into the store to buy liquor, I could hand it to them and say, give me $5 when you come out after you're done using it, and they would be able to use it and appear to be me. That would be illegal. I'm not saying I would do that. I probably wouldn't do that. But the designers of the system say, let's make it so you can't do it. How to make it so you can't do it? Let's bind the device to someone's biometrics. Now, you could bind it to the biometrics in the whole network situation, or you could bind the device's own biometric functionality if it has a thumbprint sensor, so that it can't be unlocked by the person who's trying to present it. And again, we are trying to defend the system from a malicious holder. But the holder's device gets bound to themselves, so nobody else can use it. So these are all mechanisms of social control that are designed to put the holder at a disadvantage compared to the rest of the system. So these are not the only systems that you can design. And if you are tasked as an interesting project, as a cryptographer, with designing or evaluating a cryptographic digital ID system, I hope you will ask more questions than this. I'm often in spaces that are like protocol design spaces, like the Internet Engineering Task Force, where we work on, how should we be designing these systems? And the people who are working on them take for granted that these are the sorts of properties that we want. And so I want to run just briefly through some other options that we could be designing systems with, some of which people are picking up, and some of which are even more rare. But some of these other choices you can make around the digital ID design are focused on how do we defend the holder from the other parties that are in the system. So one of them is we can say this ID system should have a property that we call offline presentation. So when I'm doing a presentation of my device to a verifier, that communication should only involve me and the verifier. Nobody should be phoning home. I don't want the verifier to go report to the issuer, hey, DKG handed his ID to this particular restaurant, to this cigarette vendor, to this clinic, right? It's offline. The communication has to only happen between these two parties. Not every system has that property. And in fact, if you look at the ISO, the International Standards Organization, has a standard for mobile driver's licenses that explicitly allows for non-offline presentation, where the verifier phones home to the issuer every time the thing is presented. So we should be pushing to say we are only willing to accept digital ID systems that have offline presentation. There's another mechanism called selective attribute disclosure, which says I want to prove something about myself, but I don't want to give you all the details. This is the equivalent of wanting to walk into the bar and have the bouncer at the bar say, "Got it, you're 21," but not be able to scan my ID and get all the information about my home address and my eye color and whatever. Again, this defends the holder from a nosy verifier, not from a nosy issuer, but from a nosy verifier who doesn't get to learn as much. Systems that have this property are great, but I actually don't think you can design a full-blown digital ID system that has this property, because someone is going to say, I need to know who you are, right? When the cop asks you for your ID, they're generally not asking to find out, do you have a valid license to drive? They're asking to find out, who are you so I can run your identity through my database of outstanding warrants? And the cops simply will not accept a digital ID system that only does selective attribute disclosure. And this, I think, goes back again to what Carmela was saying about when we design the system, you could design a system that does all the things, but a good cryptographer who is thinking about social impact will think about how to design a system that actually limits its functionality to the narrow scope of the thing that it's trying to do, or else the expanded capabilities will be misused. And lastly, in addition to selective attribute disclosure, there's an additional property that I would call unlinkable presentations. So even if I have selective attribute disclosure, I'm only going to prove that I am 21 or older. You can build a system that's like that proves it by signing with a key that is designed only to say, this person's 21 or older, and that key has been verified. But the second time I provide that ID, it signs with that same key. That's a linkable presentation, right? If I'm paying with cash every time I buy my 6-pack of beer, then when I present that ID, the verifier, the liquor store, can say this is the same person and enter it into the database, and they can track what my purchases have been, right? We've all heard the stories about Target that identifies when, someone in the household is pregnant before the household knows that someone is pregnant, because they're tracking their purchasing patterns. So what we would also like is we'd like a digital ID system not to provide additional linkage between presentations. Now, of course, if you're not doing selective attribute disclosure, if you're giving someone's full ID, you can't do unlinkable presentations. But it'd be nice to have all of these properties as ways to defend the holder from different parts of the ecosystem. And then here's some other things that are even rarer, like less likely to be discussed than those other properties, right? We could be saying, what about the verifier identifying themselves to the holder? Why does a presentation have to be that the holder has to prove themselves to the verifier without demanding something from the verifier themselves? What if someone stands in the front of the bar and asks to check your ID? How do you know that they're working for the bar? What if it's just someone who wants to gather information about who's going into the bar? How do I know what's being done here, right? How do I know that they even have a right to ask for this information? I don't see digital ID cryptographic systems that are designed with those kinds of constraints built in to say, we need to build a system to show the holder that this is a legitimate use, so that the holder can log and find out when an abusive things happen, so that the holder has the right and the capacity to say, no, I'm not going to show my ID. And then there's sort of user interface questions there too. I know not everybody is working strictly on the cryptographic math, but we need someone who understands how usability works to be able to say, what would show up on the person's pocket supercomputer when a malicious verification is happening? How do I help the user know that they're in a situation where they can say no, and they should probably say no? Because most people, when they see a dialog box pop up, what are they looking for? They're looking for the how do I get past it option, right? How do I do the thing I'm trying to do? Maybe we want, we talked about holders device attestation to prove that that my device is actually doing the thing that the system says it should do, and is not under my control. But maybe the verifier's devices should be the ones attesting to their proper operation. right? And how do we keep track? One of the other aspects of impersonation that we don't touch on much is that the issuers themselves are free to impersonate anyone in the system. The systems are designed so that the issuer can issue whatever. So how do I know that the issuers haven't released an ID that pretends to be me? Maybe they want to do that for impersonation purposes. Maybe they want to do that to infiltrate a group chat that I'm in. Which digital ID systems are designed with some sort of key transparency or certificate transparency that gives me as the holder a defense against the issuer malfeasance? So these are examples of types of defense of the holder that flip the adversarial model that we typically use to design a digital ID system on its head. And I want to encourage you, as you're looking at systems, whether they're digital ID systems or not, to zoom out a little bit at the way the challenge has been posed and ask yourselves, what are the missing pieces here? Who's really the adversary in these systems? So I want to try to give a little bit of time back because I know this is a tight schedule, but these are some examples of types of digital ID systems that are out there. And if anybody's interested in talking through the details, if we had a smaller workshop, I would actually ask people to raise particular credential systems that they're working on and try to map them to these things and say, oh, we actually have this mechanism that does this kind of defense, that treats the holder not as the adversary, but as the person to be defended in the system. Because I would love to gather information from the brains in this room and on Zoom about which systems have the properties that we're looking for, so that we can find the systems that don't have those properties and push them to step up their game, to say, hey, the holder is not the only adversary in a digital ID system, and we want to make sure that we have clearer models. Again, my overall concern here is we are building these systems and shoving them out in the world, and everyone is going to be subject to them. Are we designing them thinking clearly enough about the power dynamics that they present? So that's my basic talk. If folks want to talk to me afterwards, or if they want to talk to me tomorrow about this, I'm definitely interested. And if there's any specific questions right now, I'd be happy to take them. But I just wanted to sort of prod at the sort of adversarial model and the cryptographic design process. So.